Welcome to Bed Crime Stories Podcast. I'm your host, T. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if after listening you feel my storytelling is worthy, please consider supporting my channel with a PayPal donation. YouTube takes 40%, which isn't great for the creator. With that out of the way, let the storytelling begin. It's a brisk, beautiful May morning in Woodland Park, Colorado. An old gold mining town with the look and feel of the Old West, Woodland Park is the kind of place you'd expect to see Wyatt Earp and the gang heading into the local saloon. Think modern-day Tombstone. Around 7,500 people live in this rustic nature lover's paradise. 20 miles west of Colorado Springs, it's surrounded by mountains dotted with tall ponderosa pines, including the snow-capped Pikes Peak. There are hiking trails galore, rivers to fish in, and woods to explore. 18-year-old Josh Maddux loves Woodland Park. It's where he grew up with his older brother Zachary and his older sisters Kate and Ruth. And he fits right in here. Half mountain man and half Renaissance guy, Josh loves hunting, fishing, camping, and taking walks as much as he revels in playing the guitar, listening to music, writing short stories, and drawing his comic series Stickman and Smiley. And with his long flowing locks and quirky sense of style, which sometimes includes a top hat as well as carrying a briefcase to school, the 6-foot-tall, 150-pound Josh stands out in the crowd. He's also known for being a really nice guy. In fact, Josh once told his sister Kate that you should never say anything mean about anyone else, and it's a credo he lives by. Ruth describes Josh as somebody who will take up learning a new instrument and then go around town making fast friends to compose songs with. Now, despite being a naturally optimistic person, Josh has been struggling for the past 2 years with intense grief. On June 1st of 2006, his older brother Zachary unalived himself on the same week that he was going to graduate from high school. Josh was just 16 years old at the time, and he took the loss very hard. Josh's father Mike said this of Josh after he went missing, quote, "I buried his older brother 2 years before, and it was so difficult on Josh. When his brother died, it pushed him over the edge. It was a big shock for the family and a big shock for Josh. He thought highly of his older brother," end quote. Although Josh continued to grieve Zachary, he was doing a lot better by 2008, and one of the activities he most enjoyed was taking walks alone. And on those walks, he often passes by a property known as the Thunderhead Ranch. It's about 2 blocks from the Maddux family home, and on the property sits a main building as well as an old abandoned log cabin. The Thunderhead Ranch has a rich and colorful history. Back in the day, it was a raucous drinking and gambling complex, and it was owned by a guy nicknamed Big Bert. Bert Bergstrom had come to America from Sweden in 1912, and he ran the Thunderhead Ranch as a dining and drinking venue. After the end of Prohibition, Big Bert also used the ranch as an illegal gambling casino, as well as a spot where locals could hook up with, shall we say, ladies of the night. At some point, Big Bert was arrested by the FBI. However, a jury of his peers found him not guilty, and he got off with a slap on the wrist. It was in the 1950s that a local builder named Chuck Murphy purchased the ranch, and for about 30 years, Chuck's brother lived in the cabin, and during that time, Chuck added a brick fireplace and chimney to it. He placed a wood-burning insert inside the chimney, a metal one, as well as a heavy rebar grate to the very top of it, and that was designed to keep the wildlife out of the cabin. Now, when Chuck's brother moved out of the cabin in 2005, Chuck stopped maintaining it, and he used it then as sort of a shed, storing old furniture in there, and he only checked on it every so often. Well, it wasn't long before raccoons, squirrels, and spiders found their way inside, not from the chimney though, and the cabin soon took on a very unpleasant stench from all the critters shacking up there. Now, on the morning of Thursday, May 8th, 2008, Josh Maddux tells his sister Kate that he's going for a walk. Not an unusual thing for Josh to do. But when several hours go by and Josh doesn't return, the family begins to worry, particularly Josh's father, Mike. After 5 days of searching and calling all of Josh's friends without getting any info, Mike finally contacts the police on May 13th. Unfortunately, the police take the stance that since Josh is 18, he's an adult and there are no signs of foul play, thus he likely ran away. But to appease Mike, they create a missing persons poster. In it, they describe Josh and point out that he's missing the tip of his right index finger, an injury that Josh got when riding his bike as a child. The poster also makes mention of Josh still grieving his older brother's death, and it says that he may be suffering mental distress. Despite the family praying every single night for Josh's return, Mike Maddux makes searching for Josh his part-time job. He heads out to campgrounds and homeless shelters in Colorado Springs, hoping to spot Josh. But Mike also secretly harbors more sinister thoughts, imagining that maybe Josh decided to go the same route as Zachary. After a while, all the worry and strain take a toll on Mike's marriage. Sometime after Josh vanished, Mike and Josh's mother divorce. And while Josh's mom moves to another home, Mike feels the need to remain in the house just in case Josh returns. Something Sebastian Rogers' mother and stepdad did not do in the beginning. Just saying. Mike never stops worrying about Josh and looking for him. In an interview with the local Pikes Peak Courier, Mike said this about Josh: "I pray for him every single day. If he's in heaven, I pray he's at peace. If he's here on earth somewhere, I pray he's okay. The pain is so great. I just have to accept it, grieve, and move on. But I want people to remember Josh." End quote. One person who remains ever optimistic is Josh's sister Kate. She keeps on her rose-colored glasses, preferring to imagine that her brother is out there somewhere having fun, and that one day soon he'll return home, maybe with a wife and kids. And she does recall Josh saying that one day he was going to disappear for a while and go on a great adventure. Kate also dreams of maybe seeing her brother one day on a stage playing guitar in a band, or perhaps coming across a novel on Amazon with his name on the cover. For Kate to survive the loss of her only remaining brother, she has to remain hopeful. Now, one of the more upsetting parts of having a missing family member is when an unidentified body turns up on the news. Each time Josh's family hears about a new John Doe being found deceased anywhere remotely close to Woodland Park, they steel themselves for the very real possibility that it might be Josh. And each time the John Doe turns out to be someone else, they breathe a collective sigh of relief. So Josh goes missing in 2008, and then in the summer of 2015, the Maddux's neighbor, Chuck Murphy, decides to demolish the old abandoned cabin on the family's property. He's going to develop some high-end homes there. On August 7th, Chuck Murphy and a construction crew are about to use heavy machinery to tear down the cabin. Chuck notices that same sickening odor about the place, and before they can demolish the brick fireplace and chimney, they have to move a massive piece of furniture, a breakfast bar, that is smack up against the fireplace, covering the opening. Apparently that breakfast bar used to be on an opposite wall, and it was torn off and then pushed against the fireplace at some point. Chuck can't remember doing it, though. After Chuck and the workers move the massive breakfast bar away from the fireplace, they notice some clothing neatly folded on the ground. There's a pair of pants, underwear, socks, and shoes. It's very strange to find that behind that breakfast bar. Then, as Chuck and the crew break through the brick into the chimney, they get the shock of a lifetime. It's a partially mummified body upside down. The body is lodged in the fetal position inside the chimney, and its knees are above the head, and a hand is covering the face. The legs are skeletonized, and oddly, the only piece of clothing on the body is a long-sleeved thermal shirt. It's impossible to know if the demolition crew and their work caused the body to shift in any way. Murphy calls the police. He's certain that whoever did this did not get into the chimney from the roof. Again, the rebar on top of the chimney was still in place when the demolition began, and it would have been impossible for anyone to get inside the chimney from the top of the cabin. But then there's also that huge breakfast bar in front of the fireplace. If somebody crawled inside the fireplace and the chimney, wedged themselves up there, upside down, how in the heck did they get the breakfast bar in front of the fireplace? To Chuck, the whole scene spells foul play. So the remains are taken to the county coroner's office. The coroner, Al Bourne, is going to complete the autopsy. In early September of 2015, reporter Bill Vogren of the Pikes Peak Courier calls up Mike Maddux and another lady named Pam White. She's the mother of another missing boy, a kid named Lucas. Vogren wants to discuss the possibility that the body could belong to either one of those boys. Mike Maddux waxes lyrical about Josh. He tells Vogren what a wonderful boy Josh was. He describes him as the kindest, nicest, brightest boy ever. And Mike also tells Vogren that Josh has been missing for 7 long years without any potential sightings. And it's in this interview that Mike expresses for the first time his fear that Josh may have done what his older brother Zachary did. Mike tells Vogren, quote, "For a long time, every time the phone would ring, I expected it to be the morgue or the police. Once they found a body in New Mexico and thought it might be him. You just play a waiting game. You have an empty chair at the table and an empty place in your heart. At least with my older son, I know where he's buried. At least I have that closure. With Josh, you don't know and you just wait. And every time I see a report like last week, I get a sick feeling in my stomach. I wonder if they found my son." At some point, you've got to accept the fact that Josh may never come home, and we may never know what happened to him. You can't live with an open wound. This destroyed our family. I'm grateful to have my 2 girls. All you can do is try to keep working and try to find any happiness you can if there is any. There's no answers. In cases like the recent one, it reopens the wounds. Then I wait and see. You pray it's not your son, but you know it's somebody's son or daughter, and they cared about them and loved them and missed them like we do." End quote. It would take weeks for the body in the cabin to be identified. Finally, through dental records, it turned out to be Josh Maddux. This was incredibly upsetting to the family on so many levels. First, they now knew that Josh hadn't been off somewhere living his best life. Second, finding out that their beloved son and brother had been stuck in a chimney just a few blocks from the family home was over the top upsetting. Josh's sister Kate told the Huffington Post, quote, "One of the most traumatic things about this story is that the cabin he was found in is literally 2 blocks away from my dad's house. We looked through every part of the woods we thought he could walk to, but that cabin never came up." End quote. And the family had no idea why Josh would have gone to that broken down old cabin. It wasn't a place where they'd played as children, and it smelled to high heaven. So it wasn't exactly an enticing place to go and have an adventure. Now, on September 29th of 2015, the news broke that the body had been identified as Josh. And on that same day, the coroner, Al Bourne, announced to the media that an autopsy had conclusively determined that Josh's death was an accident. Bourne was insistent that Josh did not die by anyone else's hand, and that's because there were no indications of foul play. But then Bourne said that it seemed like Josh had suffered a, quote, horrible death. Bourne told multiple media outlets, including the local Pikes Peak Courier, the Colorado Springs Gazette, and the Huffington Post, that Josh must have climbed down from the roof into the chimney and that, quote, it appears to have been a voluntary act to gain access, end quote. Bourne emphasized that Josh was very tall and skinny and was probably shimmying down the chimney Santa Claus style to get in. But when he reached the bottom, there was a wood-burning insert that would have made it impossible for him to maneuver out from the position he was in. In his Huffington Post interview, Bourne said, quote, it was not an instant death. How he died is only a matter of speculation, but we know he did not starve to death because that takes many weeks. So then you go down the chain and you have dehydration. We have no evidence to say which came first. He could have been yelling, but nobody would have heard him. Houses were quite distant, and they probably wouldn't have heard anything anyway, because the sound would have been muffled because of his location in the chimney. I can't imagine the pain that family went through. The first one, they knew where that person is and could bring closure. I'm assuming he's referring to Zachary. For the second, there was 7 years before they could bring closure. That interim had to be brutal, end quote. Bourne concluded, there are going to be some questions that are unanswerable, end quote. Here's what's all the more upsetting about this case. For a long time after Josh went missing, some anonymous friends of his from school kept calling the police with the same tip. They claimed that a local guy who knew Josh had been boasting about unaliving him. But, as happens all too often, the police, for whatever reason, failed to investigate the tips. They didn't consider them credible, especially given the coroner's ruling that Josh died by accident after trying to get into the cabin. The demolition of the cabin was finished on September 30th, so that was just 2 days after Josh's body was identified. And the demolition was done before Chuck Murphy learned anything about Bourne's autopsy findings. Murphy thought all along that Josh was unalived by somebody else. And by the time he realized that the coroner felt otherwise, he'd already demolished the cabin. So detectives and other experts could not go there and analyze the scene. They couldn't do any testing to try and figure out exactly how Josh could have ended up in that position in the chimney. On October 2nd, the story of Josh's death turned up in the international news, and Bourne's comments about Josh dying a horrible death caught everyone's attention. Suddenly, articles with titles like Horror of Teen in Cabin Coffin showed up in the newspapers. As soon as news broke that Josh's death had been deemed an accident by the coroner, Chuck Murphy called the local police to demand that the investigation be reopened. During the initial short investigation, no one had bothered to call Chuck Murphy to ask about the cabin, the property's history, what he saw when he and his work crew stumbled on the body, how the body was positioned, how there was rebar at the top of the chimney, and the wood-burning metal insert. It was only on October 3rd that Murphy and Coroner Bourne finally met up to discuss Bourne's theory and how it did not line up with how the chimney was built and the position that the body was found in. Murphy described the grate like this. It was a heavy wire grate, a wire mesh, installed across the chimney about one row of bricks from the top. We didn't want trouble with raccoons and things getting into the chimney, end quote. Murphy explained that investigators did not know about that grate because the crew had already removed it before they went to demolish the chimney and found the body. Murphy was insistent that Josh could not have entered the chimney from the top because of that heavy rebar grate. Now, Coroner Bourne wasn't told about the grate because the cops didn't know about it. And with Chuck Murphy never having been interviewed, he never had the opportunity to tell detectives about it. Coroner Bourne appeared to not want to acknowledge the grate. Media that nobody saw the metal grate, it wasn't in any of the photos taken at the property right when the body was discovered. He just seemed to not want to have to change his ruling from accident to anything else. Chuck Murphy, on the other hand, felt strongly that foul play must have been involved. Murphy told the media his side of the story, and in his story was a very disturbing detail that neither law enforcement or the coroner's office had shared with reporters. And that was when Josh's body was found, he was wearing only a long-sleeve thermal shirt. All the rest of his clothes were neatly folded on the ground behind the breakfast bar. Murphy couldn't think of any reason why Josh would take off his pants, his underwear, his socks, his shoes, and then crawl up into the chimney from below and get into the fetal position with his knees above his head. Chuck Murphy concluded, quote, "It's a real conundrum, a tragic, terrible story. All I know is he did not go down that chimney. He got in the fireplace and went up. But why?" End quote. Coroner Bourne continued to say that in order for him to rule the death foul play, there would have to be more evidence of a crime. He told two newspapers, quote, "The hard tissue showed no signs of any trauma. There were no broken bones. There were no knife marks. There were no bullet holes." End quote. Bourne also pointed out there was no rope, no duct tape, and the soot in the fireplace was not disturbed in any way to indicate a struggle. But remember, the fireplace was in the process of being demolished when Josh's body was found, and that huge breakfast bar had been moved. This means any debris and soot would have been disturbed by the demolition team before investigators even got there. As neatly packaged as he was inside the chamber, if there were more people involved, we have absolutely no clues. Bourne believes that Josh likely died of hypothermia. I checked online for the temperature on May 8th of 2008 in Woodland Park, Colorado, and I discovered that the low was 43 degrees, which is about 6 degrees Celsius for those of you in Europe. According to the U.S. Forest Service's website, hypothermia is most likely at very cold temperatures, but it can occur at even cool temperatures above 40 degrees Fahrenheit if a person gets chilled. Bourne did acknowledge that he could not say conclusively what the cause of death was, and that's very important. Some sources on Josh's case took this to mean that hypothermia was the determined and definitive cause of death. But it's not, especially if Bourne only said likely. That means the official cause of death could not have been determined. Something like somebody putting their hands around Josh's neck likely would not have shown up on skeletal remains, unless the hyoid bone was broken. And I guess it wasn't. So this makes Murphy's theory about Josh being unalived a little bit more plausible. Let's go back to the friends who reported that a local guy was bragging that he unalived Josh. That guy is Andrew, or Andy Richard Newman. Listen as I read what one of Josh's alleged friends wrote on Reddit in 2024. I say alleged because this is Reddit, and we can't 100% verify that this is really a friend of Josh's. But what this person writes does sound credible. The friend wrote, quote, "Josh was one of my close friends. He was pretty reclusive, and there were only a few of us that truly knew him. We all tried to go to the cops and tell them that Andy Newman unalived Josh. No one cared. Andy had already been implicated in an unaliving in New Mexico and was bragging about putting Josh in a hole. Nobody took us seriously. Josh didn't do that to himself. He was eccentric at times, but he would never have just crawled into a chimney without clothes. Andy Richard Newman was arrested on suspicion of a fatal stabbing in New Mexico. Now, during high school, Newman played guitar in a band called the Bombers and was also well-known and seemingly well-liked. In an article about his arrest for the New Mexico crime, there are several replies from users who'd gone to school with Newman, who describe him as intelligent and a very smart guy. Although he seems to have left Colorado and traveled nomadically around the country after high school, he did keep in contact with many of his old friends, so it's not entirely implausible that Josh and Andy could have met up. In a later Reddit thread, one user stated that they believe Andy Newman is now in a mental hospital somewhere. He sounds like a deeply troubled person. So the mystery remains to this day. How did Josh Maddux end up deceased in such a sus folded position, wearing just a thermal top inside a brick chimney that was blocked with a rebar grate on the top, and whose fireplace opening was also blocked by a massive piece of furniture? Let's hope that someday something comes out to tell the family one way or another what really happened to their beloved Josh. That's all for today, and I will see you guys next time on Bed Crime Stories.
We had most of the building down, and inside was the body of a man.